Hello, and welcome to this week's presentation in Politics of Southeast Europe. We'll be talking about social change in the post-socialist and post-conflict period. I think it's easy to say we know that societies in the region are changing. What I would like to discuss is how this is something that we don't necessarily know, and also I'd like to concentrate on some causes and some consequences of social change in the region. Let me give you a few categories of social change. First, we can talk about change that is specifically related to post-socialism and to the transformation of societies from state socialist systems to whatever kind of system it is developing now. That's a matter of debate. We could say that the legacies of old systems include a set of expectations, including social expectations, expectations that needs will be addressed and met, and they probably also include a legacy of authoritarianism, that is, expectations related to how decisions are made and expectations on the part of power holders in relation to the kind of authority that they are likely to possess. We can also talk about elements of change that are rooted in the post-conflict situation, and the post-conflict situation pulls in two opposite directions. First, there are demands, especially demands on the part of victims, but also demands on the part of upcoming generation for understanding, for reconciliation, for restoration, for recognition. We could say that these are also demands for truth, although some of the demands are material demands having to do with addressing needs that arise from the experience of violence. And at the same time, the post-conflict situation leads to a set of demands for retrenchment, for justification of violence or for avoidance of blame or guilt. And this takes the form of long-term disputes over symbols and their meaning and their importance. We can also talk about a set of economic changes, the sorts of changes that are generally lumped into the broad category of neoliberalism. This includes the expanding primacy of the market, the tendency to try to create markets in places where markets had not previously existed, which includes both privatization of publicly owned property and economic activity and industry, um, and also declining provision by the state. And here there is also a contradiction in the situation that declining provision by the state is combined with high levels of dependency on state provision, as well as, because of the informal power that's exercised through the political sector, extensive state and party control over the so-called private sector, which is not entirely private. It depends heavily on relationships with the state. We can also talk about neo-traditionalism of various types. That is the operation of nostalgia and the power of the myth that the communist period, or in some versions of the myth, the nationalist period that followed the communist period, was a diversion from a normal path of history. And what we can see in the neo-traditionalist movement is the reassertion of the power of traditional institutions, in particular institutions related to property and institutions related to religion. And finally, as another outline of social change, we can talk about what's been described under the term sociocide. This is a term that was coined by the sociologist Karl Turza. And this is an argument that political change, violence, economic restructuring and reshaping, and the rise of criminal elites constitute an attack on the bonds between people in the social environment and the expectations that citizens have for normalcy, for predictability, a condition of permanent disorientation. Now, if these are general outlines of social change, let's add to these outlines a few background social facts. First, there is a set of demographic facts. High immigration, low birth rate, and increasing average age. Most countries in the region, if we want to talk about their population, here the exception is Kosovo, are getting older and smaller. That is, there is a higher proportion of people, especially people over 60, people of pension age in the population, a tendency for younger people to leave the country to seek work and livelihoods elsewhere. Second, There are background political facts. States in the region are compelled to respond to political conditions that they did not create. Um, these include conditions like the flow of migration and refugees through the region. They include conditions like the demand for privatization and shrinking of the public sector in states, and they are compelled to respond to economic conditions that they did not create, in particular the ongoing economic crisis of Europe and the states of the European Union. As a result of this, states have tended toward the pursuit of stability at all costs and have tended toward increased centralization and authoritarianism, so that the expectation that the democratic reforms that were announced in the period beginning in the 1990s, culminating mostly in the region around 2000, the expectation that these reforms would become permanent has not been met. And we can talk about some social facts. We can talk about low levels of trust and legitimacy in institutions, in particular in political institutions. We can talk about, especially in new national states, or if we want to call them nationalist states, a tendency toward ideological rigidity, toward control in the field of ideas. And we can talk about an ongoing search in the context of frequent changes in the basic justification of political order, an ongoing search for stable reference on which to build identity. Now, these are the general outlines of social change over the last few decades. Let's go on in the next section to discuss some elements about how all of these elements of change are experienced in the region.